can't handle the truth.
And good Monday morning here on September 30th. The year is already 3/4 gone. I'm Donald Brown, your host of Truth versus News Incorporated. And we're here with a very special guest today. Of course, I have Jim Fetcher, the most dangerous mind in America, and Scott Bennett, who's done this wonderful, and he's brought us a special guest, Catherine Shakdam, who's a political analyst and commentator for the Middle East, with a special focus on Yemen and radical movements. She's out of England, and she's the director of programs for the shakdam, Institute for Middle Eastern Studies, and served as a special advisor for the Middle East for Prince Ali Shiraz of Afghanistan. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, but
yeah. So anyway, I think we've got a very special show, folks. You want to start recording this and getting ready to share it. This is 2 hours of the most important news you're going to get around and the truth, because the news media, as you can see, is total farce. The things have gotten out of hand. I think it's really crazy. It's all scary what's going on. So go ahead, Jim.
We begin in the Middle East, where the U.S. tries to blame Syria for a chemical attack as doubts grow about past claims. The U.S. Department of State has issued a new statement claiming that the Syrian government used chlorine gas in a May 19th rocket attack. Blaming Syria for chemical attacks is a go-to policy, but it's ill-timed, coming amid growing doubts about the much larger April 2017 accusation, with scientists reporting evidence they were false. The attacks were staged. Meanwhile, the U.S. goes ahead moving on the basis of the fabricated claims to prepare for new strikes on Syria over these new chemical allegations. According to Aviapro, the U.S. has intensified its flights along the Syrian border, which may indicate Washington is working out plans to strike the Arab Republic. The U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said the United States has concluded that the government of Bashar al-Assad had used chlorine gas in the May attacks. Meanwhile, Moscow has observed that the U.S. occupier is openly siding with terrorists in relation to new sanctions by blacklisting a shipping company and 5 vessels for supplying the Russian military battling terrorists in Syria with fuel. The U.S. has come out as a sponsor of militants there, the Russian Foreign Ministry has reported. Moscow has minced no words responding to the move, saying by punishing people and entities who make it possible for Russian warplanes to destroy militant positions, the U.S. has in effect admitted it's in league with terrorists. The U.S. has exposed itself as a terrorism enabler, the ministry said, that the fight against terrorists on the ground will continue despite the fact that the U.S. is patronizing them and illegally occupies part of this sovereign country's territory. The ministry noted that while the U.S. used the situation in Crimea as a pretext for sanctions, it did not bother to cover its true intention now. The mask has fallen. This is directly about seeking to prevent the complete eradication of terrorists on the Syrian soil. With their massive armaments in Syria, however, I think it's very unlikely that the Russians will not actively oppose any U.S. attempts to invade Syria, which means it has the enormous potential for igniting a war there. Scott.
I don't see Scott.
Catherine, go right ahead while Scott re-enables. Your thoughts about it.
Sure. Well, there's a lot to unpack with this, but we've been talking about this for several years now. I mean, since the very beginning of America's intervention in Syria, we talked about false flag, and this is not the first time that America, I'm afraid, is playing this false narrative and trying to argue legitimacy in having a military intervention somewhere in the Middle East on the claim that either we have weapons of mass destruction, and of course I'm referring to Iraq, or in the case of Syria, alleging that the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad was actually using chemical weapon against his own people, in which case America felt it had to intervene. And a lot of the time, I think that the public failed to realize that it wasn't so much about military intervention. It was about what the US was actually supporting on the ground in terms of the political narrative and the factions that the US was willing to collaborate with, not just in Syria, but in Iraq. And of course, again, I'm referring to ISIS here, because a lot of the time, America's intervention has meant that groups such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others have grown in power, have grown in military capacity, in the sense that weapons were actually funneled to them, including funds, and training was offered to them. So it's not just intervention, it's about everything else that comes with the US intervention. We know very well today that Jordan, for example, provided training for ISIS militants. We know, for example, that Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region, including Qatar, help funnel millions of dollars to ISIS elements within Syria and within Iraq as well. Because when we talk about Syria, we should not divorce it from what happened in Iraq. Because, of course, Al-Qaeda and ISIS elements were moving in between the two countries. So you have a situation where de facto, the American government and taxpayers' money were used to support terrorism. Given the fact that America went to war against terrorism and terror, on the wake of 9/11, we need to ask ourselves the question, what are we doing there? And then when I say we, I'm including, of course, the British government, because it's not just the US. I mean, my government as well is very much involved in what is happening in Iraq today, what is happening in Syria and other countries across the Middle East. And I feel that a lot of the time we're not being told the truth, and people are reacting to the news that they offered and the tales that politicians are giving them. And I'm afraid to say that a lot of the time, if not all the time, they are being lied to, and people are too lazy a lot of the time to actually check facts for themselves and take the time to even fathom the possibility of political manipulation for very obvious reason, which is, having more power. And America wants to be a superpower controlling the fate of the world. And so it's acting a little bit erratically. I'm going to be polite here. And it's dangerous. It's dangerous for the American people. It's dangerous for the world, because, of course, we are empowering people who potentially, could come and attack us back. And now they actually have the military capacity to do so. So are we being clever? Not really. I think we're being very short-sighted. And what is happening in Syria could very well happen in any Western capital in the world when it comes to bringing terrorism back home. So what we did there as an experiment could come and haunt us back here. And I don't think that anyone wants to see that.
Scott.
Well, can I ask a real quick question? ISIS, what does that stand for? Does it stand for Israeli Secret Intelligence Services?
Well, I was told that it's actually standing for the Islamic State, for something. But yes, I mean, some people argue that it was born, by way of the CIA and other intelligence services. It could well maybe, because I mean, for all intents and purposes, we definitely helped it come to life and to grow. So whether it was born out of the Wahhabist ideology of Saudi Arabia or not initially is of little consequence if we bear in mind that it was helped by the CIA, by other intelligence services across the West. So at the end of the day, we definitely helped to make it come alive.
Mike Flynn was actually fired from his position as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency for opposing its creation in 2012. Catherine, it's a stunning story. Scott, please, your comments.
Well, I'm sorry I was knocked off. Someone obviously didn't want me commenting or with the superhero of Catherine Shakdam, but I'm delighted to be honored with her. Of course, everything she's describing is absolutely accurate. And it's funny, you know, coming from a military background, I saw all of this back in 2008, 2009, 2010. They've been trying to blame Syria for the creation of ISIS way back then. And that was a lie that the Israeli intelligence were feeding us in Special Operations Command, and it's, you know, 9 years later we see this the seedling of poisonous fruit coming up, and it's led to chaos and destruction. It's amazing that Donald Trump still has not fully embraced the strategic changes that need to occur in Syria to protect Americans. Instead, he's doubled down and allowed these fools in the CIA and the Obama administration, and I think it was an Obama CIA agent that was sympathizing with John Bolton and the neocons who just recently released this Ukrainian nonsense. So Trump is on attack from all sides, and he's not going to be persuasive to these people. And for that reason, when he does stupid things like firing Tomahawk missiles into Syria, that's a declaration of war. That's a declaration of war for a chemical attack that did not occur. Senator Dick Black and many other people have been back there and done exhaustive forensic analysis. The children were not subjugated to any sort of a chemical attack. All of that was theater, and it was theater designed, you know, large part. Ivanka Trump, his daughter, comes running in with tears and yelling, "Daddy, Daddy, little babies are dying," and all of that was fraudulent. It's the same thing as the British saying the ducks were dying, and all of that theatrics and drama that triggers Donald Trump's from the hip gunslinging actions. But it's dangerous because you're now picking fights and waging war in a way that you don't get to control. You don't get to say we're firing missiles in Syria, because Syria, Iran, Russia, or other countries could say, no, you're declaring war on Syria. And once you do that, your schools, your hospitals, your old folks' homes, your infrastructure, your Facebook, your YouTube, your economic dynamism plants are subject to attack as well. If you're going to fire missiles in Syria, then be prepared for missiles to be fired at you. That's the real danger, that this can very quickly escalate into a World War I model that opens up World War III. And it's not necessarily a long, drawn-out, protracted battle. World War III could be initiated, fought, and concluded within 90 days. 90 days, because at the end of 90 days, you have a decimated portion of the American landscape and other, you know, global landscapes as well, and you have an immediate suing for peace. And that's the real danger, because these wars can get out of control very quickly, and it could pound America into the dark ages. And we're already schizophrenic enough. And I'll end it by saying one of the other stories that we may get into that I've just been doing with RT and others has been the phenomenon of the military suicides. The reason that American servicemen are killing themselves is because they're discovering 9/11 as a false flag attack. They're discovering they've been hired and used as slaves in this endless military juggernaut around the world. And they are also being pressured and psychotropically experimented on with Ambien, Xanax, and all sorts of antidepressant drugs that deplete their serotonin levels and cause them to absolutely fall apart. This is what the American medical industry, the American Veterans Affairs, and the American government are doing to their veterans, and at the same time registering them as the greatest domestic terror threat in America. So this is one of the reasons that men and women, especially men, are killing themselves in the military, is because they're discovering all of this evil, Jim.
Oh,
Yeah, discovering they've been killing innocent people for the wrong reason. It fostered false beliefs fostered by their own government. Here we have Rouhani's plan to offer the U.S. and the Saudis a path out of the dead end their policies have created. He was coming to the UN to propose a cooperative agreement to stabilize and secure the Persian Gulf region. He'll also get the Iranian nation's message across to the international community, where the people are suffering from a cruel economic war. Iran is a nation of resistance and wants everyone to return to their commitments and laws. Would that could come to pass. Meanwhile, President Trump appears open to the idea of diplomacy, despite Washington's August request for Australia, France, Germany, Japan, Norway, South Korea, and the UK to join a maritime coalition in the Persian Gulf. I never rule anything out. Nothing scheduled at this moment, he claimed when asked about a possible meeting. He almost immediately began walking it back, however, when it came to entertaining French President Emmanuel Macron's offer to mediate. We don't need a mediator, he said. Meanwhile, President Rouhani at the UN warned that a single blunder could fuel a big fire, really world war, as Scott was sketching it, in the Middle East. Iranian President Rouhani warned that world leaders that tensions are high in the Persian Gulf and a single blunder could fuel a big fire during the 74th United Nations General Assembly. He directly addressed President Trump, calling him the incumbent president. Our response to any negotiations under sanctions is negative. Rouhani called out the U.S. for international piracy and merciless economic terrorism, referring to the increase in U.S. sanctions. U.S. Acting Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs Hugh Dugan was at the U.S. seat while Trump was focused on the impeachment inquiry. Iran's president said he was neither interested in negotiations nor a memento photo with Trump. He said the region is on the edge of collapse, pointing to conflicts in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, and said the Trump administration was unable to bring peace to conflicts in those countries. Since the U.S. withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the Trump administration has imposed biting sanctions and prevented other nations from continuing to trade with Iran. Grossly unjust, grossly unfair. Fascinating story and development. The Houthis have neutralized thousands of Saudi-led coalition personnel in a large-scale ambush in the war in Yemen. Thousands of Saudi-led coalition personnel were killed, injured, or captured by the Houthis and their local allies in a large-scale ambush Operation Victory from God, a spokesman for the Yemeni group announced on September 28th. It included the following elements: the defeat of 3 military brigades of the enemy with full military equipment and most of their members and commanders, seizure of large numbers of weapons, including hundreds of vehicles, thousands of enemy personnel captured, hundreds killed or injured. The captured included large numbers of commanders, officers, soldiers. Only 72 hours after the start of the operation, Houthi forces fully enforced a siege on the enemy. Absolutely fascinating development, which has been confirmed by multiple other sources. I'm quite sure Catherine will have much to say about this. Let us begin with you, Catherine, on this development in Yemen.
There's a lot to say when it comes to Yemen. And I think that Yemen is actually, I mean, we're entering a pivot point when it comes to not just the war in Yemen, but the way that regional dynamics are actually playing. So now, if you look, I mean, you know, the interesting thing that is actually happening to Yemen right now, I actually discussed with Scott many, many times. I mean, we had conversation over the past 2 years where there was the possibility of an incursion onto Saudi Arabia. And I was explaining that this particular region of Saudi Arabia, the southwest of Saudi Arabia, is actually disputed land. Once upon a time, and not too long ago, back in the 1930s, that was Yemeni land. And then there was a dispute that went on and on decades. And eventually in 2000, during the Jeddah Treaty, the Saudi and the Yemeni agreed. The Yemeni actually agreed to give up their claim onto the Jizan, Najran, and Asad, which are the southwestern province of Saudi Arabia. But we have to understand that because of the tribal nature of Yemen, those provinces, feel much more connected to their Yemen heritage than they are to Saudi Arabia because of their tribal affiliations and their tribal allegiances. What is interesting is that at the very onset of the war against Yemen, the Houthis sent delegations into those 3 provinces asking for tribal leaders to basically make a choice and decide whether they would side with the Saudi government or return home, so to speak, and decide to support the resistance movement. Interestingly, the tribes back then decided to stay neutral, so they refused to collaborate in Saudi Arabia's war efforts against what they saw as their brothers and cousins, and they decided to stay on the fence. Now, as of yesterday, the Houthis issued a statement thanking the tribes of Najran for their efforts in helping them seize control over Saudi Arabia military and weaponry. So that, for me, is even more important to this war development than any victory that they managed to score against Saudi Arabia, because it means that as of today, war dynamics have completely changed, where Yemen is not only pushing against foreign intervention, but actually gaining ground against Saudi Arabia. Now, if you understand anything about the history and political makeup of Saudi Arabia, you will understand that this is an existential threat against Al Saud theocracy, because this belief so far that Saudi had, that Al Saud is almighty and all powerful within the land, has been shattered. It means that as of today, if anyone decides to rise up against Al Saud, they actually stand a chance, because the Houthi, who are a ragtag army, let's just say it, they have flip-flops. They don't have, the training or even the weaponry that, for example, the Saudi have access to. And yet, they still managed, despite famine, despite cholera, despite great many hardships, to actually score an immense victory within Saudi Arabia. We're not talking about pushing against, we're talking about an invasion here, a ground invasion. Now, if you look at the scale of that invasion, you need to understand that did not just happen in a day. So for months and months and months, the Houthi were actually planning this attack against Saudi Arabia, because they knew that the Saudi were themselves planning to invade Yemen from the ground, which is why they allowed them to gather weapons and men into one area so that they would pounce on them and take everything over. Now, the biggest question, if I'm Saudi Arabia, the biggest question I want to ask is that, number one, why is it that I'm paying billions of dollars worth of lucrative contracts to Britain and the United States of America, France and Germany and other countries, and basically paying to be protected as a regime? Where is the intelligence? Where is the CIA? Where is the intelligence services of Britain and France? Where is the protection that I was promised? Because so far, either the CIA did not know, and then I'm asking questions to the validity of, or the potency of the office, because, what are you doing with yourself? Or they did know, and they didn't tell. And that's the biggest question, because then you need to be asking yourself, what are you playing at? Because Saudi Arabia, or Al Saud, is supposed to be a strategic ally of the United States of America. So I'm not quite sure what will happen. I'm not quite sure what Riyadh will make of it, but for sure, it has nothing to do with Iran. It has everything to do with the fact that Yemen today has become not just a ragtag army or just a resistance movement, but a very capable military power in the Arabian Peninsula. And that challenges Saudi Arabia hegemony in the region. It means today that when Abdelmalek al-Houthi, the leader of the resistance movement in Yemen, is telling the UAE that it wants to target Dubai next in order to kick the Emiratis out of Yemen and prevent them from influencing Yemen any further, it means that they need to take it seriously, because they can. And they can better today than they could yesterday. And they did yesterday, because they targeted Aramco and no one could do anything against it. And they did target the UAE interest in Yemen and at home as well. So now there's this issue of not only drone strikes that have become very, very real, and the ability that they do know have acquired, because they have high-grade weaponry courtesy of the United States of America. So I think that Washington needs to review its plan when it comes to Yemen. It needs to understand that looking at your enemy and just deciding off the bat that they are not worthy or that they cannot oppose you needs to end. This idea that Yemen cannot do anything because it's a poor country needs to be reassessed. You can be poor, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of your ability to actually cause harm, should you want to. And the problem is, Yemen was, until now, rather peaceful and without any hegemonic ambition as such. Now they do, because now they have discovered that, yes, they can target Saudi Arabia, and yes, they can take back the land, and yes, they can challenge Riyadh authority, not just over the Arabian Peninsula, but the entire region, because today we have a resistance network. It's not just Yemen operating as Yemen. It's Yemen, and behind Yemen, you need to look at countries such as Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, and then, maybe other friendlies who have decided that, the time and era of the Saudi has ended. So now, what do we do?
This
Yeah.
is a sensational
Great
development.
question.
Scott,
Well,
follow
Well,
up that
she
brilliant,
had me
brilliant
breathless. I didn't want the story to end. Now what do we do?
summation.
Continue
Yeah,
next
she's
week
great.
in Masterpiece Theater as Catherine Shockdom narrates.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, she's exactly right. You know, the funny thing, Jim, this is a heroic tale of an underclass of ragtag, I like that term, fighters and mountain men and Davy Crockett types fighting against an oppressive redcoat army. Where did we see this before? Oh yeah, in 1776 when the American continental beaver trappers and mountain men and all the rest of our state militias rose up to overthrow the greatest superpower in the world at the time, the British Empire. And they did, not by invading London, but by kicking them out of Connecticut, encircling them and capturing and killing and doing guerrilla warfare. This is a tale of heroic uprising that I think has a lot of moral, psychological resonance that can be capitalized into an incredible propaganda campaign that immediately starts to wither and deteriorate and degrade the Saudi Arabian moral consciousness, as well as its socio-political, military, economic relationships and alliances, which essentially doesn't have any anymore. And now that it's running out of oil, in a sense, it has lost its value. The ride is broke down, so the ticket's no longer valuable. So I think in a very real sense, this action by Yemen is going to provoke and immediately make the Saudis begin to sue for peace, sue for a resolution that results in them continuing to exist if the Yemenis are in a good mood. If the Yemenis are not in a good mood, if they say, no, you know what, you've poisoned us with cholera, you've destroyed our power plants, you've bombed wedding parties, you've bombed schools, and now it's our turn. Now we've got our second wind, and we're going to come after you and destroy every tyrannical dictator in the House of Saud and free every oppressed person, like the rebellion overthrowing the Dark Lords of Sith in the Empire Star Wars saga. There's a very real possibility that you could have a momentous freedom fighter movement against Saudi Arabia that catches fire. I love that graphic Don had on with the Statue of Liberty casting fire across the globe. You could have a similar graphic in Yemen casting water droplets all over the Middle East to put out the fires that Saudi Arabia, Great Britain, and the United States and Israel started. So Yemen is on the rise, Saudi Arabia is on the decline, and I think President Trump realizes that, and he's also becoming quickly aware that John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and Elliot Abrams and all of these other neocon Zionist idiots that have been pushing him into Venezuela and Syria and pushing him against Russia, pushing him to back Ukraine with Javelin missiles. Trump has been saying, why the hell are we in Ukraine? There's no benefit to us. We're antagonizing the Russians. That's antithetical to what I said I was going to do. So you're making me look like a hypocrite or an incompetent fool, and I don't like either. And I think that same rationale is going to be spreading down into the other theaters of foreign policy. And Yemen is a great freedom fighter, to give them an example. Jim?
Well, real quick question.
Once again, the U.S. has been on the wrong side of history. Don?
That's right. Oh yeah, real quickly, you mentioned repressed peoples in Saudi Arabia. What do you think about the female population of Saudi Arabia?
Thanks, Don. Meanwhile, Bibi will return his mandate to Rivlin, the Jerusalem Post reports. Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu will return his mandate to President Rivlin after being unable to form a government, according to the Jerusalem Post. The decision late Wednesday by President Rivlin to hand Netanyahu first crack at building a coalition granted the Israeli leader a lifeline a week before he faces crucial hearings on corruption allegations. Blue and White, which won the most seats, however, rejected demands from him to form a unity government under his leadership with his right-wing and ultra-Orthodox Jewish allies. Gantz has not ruled out an alliance with Likud, but said he would not do so with Netanyahu in that position. Meanwhile, a fascinating historical retrospective, it turns out the Carter administration covered up reports of Israel having tested a nuclear weapon 40 years ago. Carter wrote in his diary, September 27, 1979, there was an indication of a nuclear explosion in the region of South Africa. Either South Africa, Israel using a ship at sea, or nothing, according to the report. The problem was, and it remains today, under the 1977 Glenn Amendment to the Arms Export Control Act, the United States has to cease all arms assistance to any nation not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty should it conduct a nuclear test. This is a great secret, non-secret about the Middle East that has discredited the United States in its policy making. It would be the official line of the administration and the Department of Defense to cover up the satellite findings, to proclaim it wasn't a nuclear flash at all discovered that day. It is our collective judgment the September 22nd signal was probably not from a nuclear explosion. A panel Carter convened concluded in May of 1980, but the documentary record said otherwise, as indicated by Carter's own hand. We have a growing belief among our scientists, the Israelis, did indeed conduct a nuclear test explosion in the ocean near the southern end of Africa, he wrote in his diary on February 27, 1980. A foreign policy report revealed, shockingly, the Carter administration was so afraid to enforce the partial test ban treaty against Israel's 1979 violation that it did what it could to erase or keep hidden evidence of its detection of a test. Thus, the hard science and evidence survived in the classified records, but the lie and attempt cover-up also did as well. From there, it became an entrenched lie. All future administration would use it as a smokescreen to steal public attention from what top officials well understood. That close U.S. ally Israel has long been a nuclear power, despite its public stamp to the world that it is not. Carter, of course, went forward with the Egyptian-Israeli peace deal, and apparently he was worried that it might potentially derail. But this was an outrageous development, and we've been suffering the consequences ever since. Catherine.
Where do I begin with this one? As you know, as Scots know, I'm a very big fan of Zionism, not. So when it comes to Israel and what Benjamin Netanyahu does, I'm always a little bit worried because there's always an ulterior motive, and it's usually involved more wars and more suffering for the rest of the region. So I think it's a good, in a way, I think it's a very good development and gives me hope that Benjamin Netanyahu found himself in hard political water, because it means that his people are catching up to the fact that he's a fraud and that he's more interested in making a name for himself and escaping justice by maintaining his immunity by staying in power as prime minister. And that they want to change for the country. They want a different course in terms of foreign policy, because I do believe that the Israelis as a whole understand that it's not possible to base your entire existence on the premise of war and genocide, which is essentially what Zionism has done to Israel. It's turned a country, an entire people into bloodthirsty tyrants, because, I mean, they're committing a genocide on the basis that they were themselves the victim of a genocide. So it's, I mean, there's an irony there that is just quite sad, quite frankly, but it's, I think that the reality of it all is dawning on the Israeli people. And I think that it's quite clear that today they want a different course. Now, whether or not it's possible to somehow atone for their political sins, I don't know. I don't know if the region is ready for a new kind of Israel. I don't even know if it's possible, to be quite frank with you, and I don't know what it would look like. All I do know is that people like Netanyahu do not usually give up without a good fight. And that worries me even more, because if he was dangerous on a good day, I don't know what will happen tomorrow, given the fact that he has his back against the wall. And I mean, it's always there's always the possibility that he would cook something up and launch Israel into yet another destructive war, maybe with Lebanon, or that he would do something so very terrible for the region that countries within the region would have to intervene militarily. I'm not saying that it's going to happen. I'm saying that it's always a possibility. Given the tensions existing today, I don't think that it would be a good idea, because again, I think that Israel needs to learn from Saudi Arabia's mistake, in the sense that the old order of things is over. It's we have new generations of people now being alive, having access to information, having access to knowledge that they didn't have before, in terms of their political rights, in terms of their ability to understand that there is another way, that no, they don't have to live under oppression forever, and they do not have to bow to the political status quo, that they can change things, that it happens in other countries, that it's possible, and revolutions do happen. And looking at what's happening with Saudi Arabia and Yemen, I think that the Israelis need to really pay attention to history and understand that it could happen to them, because if you look at the makeup of Saudi Arabia and Israel, it's very much based on the same idea of, this one ideology justifying, rationalizing murder. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, they have Wahhabism, in Israel, they have Zionism. It's basically two faces of the same coin. I know that people will jump up when I say this, but it's the truth. If you look at what is being preached in Zionism and what is being preached in Wahhabism, very similar. Of course, they have different enemies, but the result is the same. It's genocide. It's a call for ethnic cleansing and other horrors. So what is happening today in Israel, I think, will determine in more ways than one whether Israel's continue as we understand it today as a nation, whether Israel can cohabitate with the rest of the region, whether it wants to, and maybe possibly there could be a way where we kind of come out of it unscathed. It's the window of opportunity is very tiny and will require a lot of political courage, but it is possible. I'm an optimist. I think that we're reaching, again, a massive pivot point in the way that we understand politics, and that people now realize that bashing each other on the head is not a good idea, because our world has gone much smaller over the decades. And that means that if something happens in Syria, it will impact the UK, it will impact America. And so it's not a good idea for anyone to do that. What we need to learn is what I think Vladimir Putin learned a long time ago, back in the 1980s, when he decided to take his country out of recession and decided to use cooperation and collaboration over confrontation. And this is, I think, the moral of the story here, is that it's not working. Iraq hasn't worked. Syria hasn't worked. Israel is not working. The war in Yemen is not working for anybody, certainly not the Saudi. And so it would be much more pragmatic to refer to the kind of politics that Iran, for example, is preaching, meaning to respect nation sovereignty, to abide by the rule of law, international law, and actually work on our diplomacy to make sure that everyone's interests are served to the best of our abilities. This is not easy, but it's much, much more useful long-term than those ridiculous wars that drag every country into recession inevitably, that cause great harm to everyone, including the military personnel, and eventually are not actually serving our national interests, but actually working against our own democracy, because our democracies today have been eroded, not because of Donald Trump, essentially because we have gone to war against so many countries that we have trampled over our own rights to own political self-determination. And this is something that we haven't come to terms with, because we're so very arrogant in the West that we actually believe that we invented the principles of democracy. We didn't. We only tried to use them. We didn't come up with the whole idea of democracy. So we need to be a little bit more, I think, humbled in our approach. And we need to understand that, again, poverty and countries' economic status does not give you the right to trample over those nations' sovereign right, does not give you the right to dictate what happens to those countries, and certainly does not give us the right to actually siphon natural resources out of those countries. We need people to collaborate. We need people to be on the same legal standing. They have the same rights as we do. If we claim something for ourselves, we have to admit that those rights are valid to other people and for other nations, because otherwise we're negating our own rights. And I think that what happens to Israel has a lot to do with this. It's this kind of enlightenment. I mean, Scott talks a lot about, how people now are actually coming to terms with reality, that they are capable now of seeing through the lies that we're being told. And I think this is exactly what is happening today in Israel. People are coming out of the fog. Now, how it's going to manifest technically in the next few months, I don't know. I think it's anyone's guess. But Netanyahu is definitely on the way out. How this particular exit will map out, I'm not sure. I'm a little bit worried, but I think it's good, tentatively good. So I'm gonna stay positive and see what Scott has to say.
Scott Catherine has given us a fabulous social, political, historical perspective on Israel, where Bibi appears to be a cornered rat. Your thoughts about the situation now and what may develop?
Yeah, I'm going to attend the Catherine Shakdam School of Public Policy in London one of these days when we get that institute up. She's exactly right. The Netanyahu departure and the Israeli Likud party transformation is very, very telling. I think Catherine's sensitivity and delicateness towards what is coming is warranted, because it can be both a fiasco and a war-triggering event that drags the United States and Trump, who is itching to do some pro-Israeli operations, into a fight as an existential defender. You already see that in Lindsey Graham and the other Zionists putting up these attempts to do a treaty where the United States will come to the rescue of Israel, regardless of whatever military strike it does against Iran, Lebanon, or any other country. So we have to avoid that. And how it's avoided, of course, is through a information operation, psychological warfare situation where the surrounding countries congratulate and welcome to the side of peace and tolerance and discussion and civilized, sophisticated treatment of other human beings without resentment or remorse, or without hostility or vengeance. But the other Middle East peoples, from Iran to Lebanon to Jordan to elsewhere, Syria, can show a mighty superior moral spirit by extending a hand of friendship, saying to the Israeli people, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the kingdom prepared for thee since the foundation of the world. Well done for getting rid of the warmongers. Well done for stopping the wars. We do not want a war with the good people of Israel. We understand since 1947 things have changed. We need to settle and calm and come to agreement in the table of mutual tolerance and put down the swords and the guns. And we couldn't do it because of Netanyahu. And now we can, because you've had the courage to remove him. As the people of Israel are saying, we want peace, we will cease our building of endless settlements all the way up to the Russian border, which is what I think Netanyahu planned. We will cease this shooting of civilians in the legs to cripple them, and we will cease treating the Palestinians like animals. And all of the neighboring Muslim countries can show a superior spirit by not threatening and not leading them down the path of existential, fear that now that Netanyahu's gone, perhaps we're going to get invaded and destroyed. And Netanyahu's going to say, I told you so. No, now we have the dawn of peace. That's the way to present it. That's how Donald Trump can present it. He needs to cast Netanyahu on the ash heap of history and really have nothing to do with him anymore. Trump needs to do a pivot and go in the direction of peace. He needs to exercise Vladimir Putin in the way that Putin is meant to be designed, which is a multi-tool leader. There is no one better at world politics than Vladimir Putin. Putin is the George Washington to Russia. He is a very smart martial arts intelligence officer, politician who witnessed the climax and the heat of the battle of the Cold War, saw the transition into the lukewarm war that quickly escalated into a cannibalization operation under George Bush Sr. and then Bill Clinton and Yeltsin. Putin was present at all of these major implosions of the Russian people and culture and society, and yet Putin, in a remarkable way, emerged as the captain on the Titanic that fixed the boat and it kept on sailing. So Putin has emerged in this incredible hero's story that has continued to, I mean, elevate and Oliver Stone's, the Russian interviews, the Putin interviews was very, very powerful. So Putin is emerging as the major power broker, leader, liaison, because of what Catherine said. He's using not military confrontation, but collaboration and communication and chess playing thinking and deal making with the surrounding people. That's why Turkey is abandoning NATO. That's why Macron is about ready to jump out of a birthday cake wearing a tuxedo, channeling Joel Grey to Putin, saying, Monsieur Putin, come back to France. He knows that France and Merkel and Britain are dying, so Macron wants to get on the good side of Russia. Putin's not going to take the bait. He doesn't go that way anyway. But Putin is emerging as the major communicator liaison for the Middle East operations for Iran. China is waiting in the wings, and Putin is eyeing President Trump, saying, you see what all these people have done to you, Mr. President? By you attacking Russia with sanctions, you have shot yourself in the foot. Now, the question is, are you going to amputate your foot, or are you going to keep shooting yourself in the kneecap and the thigh and the pelvis until America just bleeds out? And that's a very real possibility. So Trump needs to pivot. He moves towards peace. He uses Putin as a liaison. He amplifies the peace communications that Israel has nothing to fear now that Likud party Netanyahu's gone. And Iran can also come and say, we're not about conquest, we're about peace. Now we can do it. Let's make it happen. Then the Trump can move in a positive foreign policy level, and he can eclipse the North Korean semi-success with a major collaboration of peace in the Middle East. Talk about something that would send off a fireworks. Anything that rings of peace in the Middle East would be enormously successful for Trump. And the only way he will do it is through Vladimir Putin, as ironic as that sounds. Jim?
Fantastic. Very good. You guys are great.
Well, we have a very stunning development here I wanted to share before we turn from the convolutions of Middle East politics to the insanity of American. State secrets privilege trumps any citizen's right to know whether or not their own government is trying to kill them. The government can try to kill you without due process as long as it can successfully invoke state secret privileges. That's the gist of a decision just reached by Judge Rosemary M. Collier of the D.C. District Court. Journalist Malai Abdul Karim believes he's been placed on the U.S. government's kill list. Karim, due to the nature of his reporting, spends a fair amount of time talking to militants involved in terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. After a series of Syrian airstrikes that narrowly missed him, Karim concluded the government must have decided he was a terrorist worth killing, even though he was only reporting about terrorist activity in Syria. His case was allowed to proceed in 2018 by Judge Collier, a former FISA judge, but now she's ending it. The state secret privilege invoked by the government is just too high to surmount, even for an American journalist who has a legitimate concern his own government is trying to kill him. At least Collier had the honesty to deliver the crushing blow right up front. What constitutional right is more essential than the right to due process before the government may take a life? While the answer may be none, federal courts possess limited authority to resolve questions presented in a lawsuit, even when they are alleged to involve constitutional rights. This is such a case. Despite the serious nature of plaintiff's allegations, this court must dismiss the action pursuant to the government's invocation of the state secret privilege. This is really stunning. At least this part is blunt, concise, and mostly coherent. Going into greater detail just puts the blinding glory of the government's hell arrest, that is catch-22, powers on full display. There is still a question as to whether the unavailability of the requested information is fatal to Mr. Karim's complaint. A court must dismiss a case in which a privilege of state secrets is sustained when, 1, disclosure is necessary for the plaintiff to make his prima facie case, 2, disclosure is necessary for the defendant to defend himself, or 3, further litigation would present an unjustifiable risk of disclosure. The U.S. focuses on Karim's prima facie case, arguing that Karim cannot establish his standing to sue without that information. The court agrees and notes all 3 reasons justify dismissal. See how it works? If a plaintiff needs certain information to pursue claims against a government, the government can simply declare them to be state secrets, instantly depriving the plaintiff of standing. It is a stunning development. It all comes down to this: extremely disheartening to read in a nation whose government took time to establish the rights the same government is now willing to suppress with its invocation of state secret privileges. To prove his prima facie case, Mr. Karim must be able to show he was in fact targeted by the U.S. with lethal force. The court previously found Mr. Karim's alleged facts sufficient, if proven, to survive a motion to dismiss. But having said that, the government is not required to disclose whether he has been targeted as alleged, making it impossible for him to obtain the information necessary to prove his claims. Without access to privileged information, he's unable to establish whether he was targeted by lethal force or what information was considered in reaching the alleged decision to target him. He is therefore incapable of demonstrating he has sustained a violation of his constitutional rights without the withheld information. The end result of the circular reasoning is a decision that basically allows the government to act as if no rights violation had occurred, as a cake and eat it situation, which can go forward with any other plans the government has to deprive other Americans of their due process by targeting them too for extrajudicial killing. If any of them find themselves a bit too close to drone strikes, for example, they have no avenue of redress that isn't blocked by state secret privileges. The House always wins. Scott, your comments.
Well, we'll let Catherine go, and I'll come after. Go ahead, Catherine.
Well, this is rather elaborate, Scott. Because of the break, I wanted you to go first.
Well, let me just say this rings of revolution, and it's exactly what Catherine was talking about a little bit earlier, when you see all of our own rights being trampled under the juggernaut, the wild horses of military conquest and the war on terror. This is precisely the casualty. Now you have an American citizen being targeted, being followed. NSA, CIA are listening to his devices. They're using that for geographical tracking. They're coordinating their strikes using him as the beacon. That is his whole justification. He does not want to be the beacon. They do not have a right to use him as the beacon. And yet the court is dismissing this because the government is saying you cannot call any evidence to show that we are targeting him, we are following him, we are violating his constitutional rights because of the state secrets. So this is something that the courts are kicking down the line. I think they're wrong. I think this needs to go to the Supreme Court, because a person has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life is the number one first thing that is mentioned in the United States Constitution. And no one, no government, no military, no president, no court can destroy a person's life because that is superior to everything about government.
Absolute due process. And of course, what they're doing is short-circuiting due process. Catherine, we have a few moments for your comments or reflections upon this absurd situation.
Well, I'm actually not surprised. I mean, I think that what happened with Snowden and Assange actually, way precursor to what is happening today, where basically people have absolutely no recourse against this titan that has become, our intelligence services and the U.S. government in this case, where everything now becomes a matter of national security and state secrecy. The problem that I have with state secrecy is that while I can understand that it is logical for certain facts to be kept hidden from the public for very obvious reason, it shouldn't be used, as a kind of a blanket statement or is just, a modus operandi in terms of how we conduct our affairs, because then that would mean that we do not live in a democracy but an actual dictatorship. Because this is the very definition of what constitutes a police state, is when individuals and civilians do not have recourse to any avenue to defend their rights, or even just be heard or ask questions to their government and demand answers. So I think that, again, I mean, we have talked about how America has devolved into something else. And I think that this something else is actually becoming so very visible that it's very difficult to even rationalize it anymore. And never mind excusing it now. And And I think that what people are accusing Donald Trump of when it comes to, breaking constitutional rights and denying people their civil rights has little to do with Donald Trump, but more to do with the system that he inherited. It doesn't mean that he doesn't bear some responsibility, but I think we need to be very careful about laying blame at his feet completely. And actually realize that the process of erosion of democracy began, way back in the 1970s. And I think that this demonization that we see today of the Republicans versus the Democrats and those ideas of, treason being floated around when we disagree with people is actually, very telling of the kind of system that we live in today, where we are not allowed to disagree anymore. We are, always labeled under certain objectives should we dare disagree with what mainstream is saying. And I think it's dangerous. I think that it's always very healthy to disagree with people, or at least understand what the opposition is saying, because if you don't do this, then you're forcing people underground. It's never a good idea to have people being forced underground, because then you don't know what it is that they're saying or believe in. And I think that the case of the Muslim Brotherhood should serve as a cautionary tale, because by driving them underground in Egypt, for example, they became the cancer that they are today, and they spread out across the region. So my advice would be for people to return back to reason and understand that the whole point of a democracy is for people to happily disagree and debate ideas without bashing each other on the head or calling each other traitor or facing annihilation because the government decided that it was more comfortable with -1 than actually managing someone's disagreement or even opinions or even truth. That's what I have to say.
Well, the second half of the show will turn to the most spectacular example of what you're dissecting there, of the failure to be tolerant, where one party is attempting to sabotage the administration of the elected government on the ground that their candidate lost, and they're fabricating evidence and pseudo justifications for taking that stance. I find it stunning that we're in this situation, but as you say, the United States no longer represents what it has always claimed to represent under its Constitution, but devolving into something like that which opposed, that which led the opposition to Great Britain and the emancipation of the United States from the Queen and Kings of England. It's a fascinating situation. We're about to take our break, and then we'll go further down the rabbit hole. Don, would you like to take us out?
Oh boy, what a take we've had here. This is fantastic, folks. This is Truth versus News for September 30th. 3/4 of the year is gone, folks, and there's actually truth versus official facts and acts that we're fighting against, and really, it's getting very serious, folks. So we'll see you in the next hour, and you'll be sure to come back and share this as you can. Okay, I think we're just about right on time here.